We are live discussing the Kiss Hello. Alrighty. So just a quick disclaimer, if the battery on my computer fails, which it might, we are on Instagram Live, so the interns can certainly tune into the live stream. Otherwise, for the group in the room today, where would you like to start? This is Seinfeld's The Kiss Hello.
I think more broadly, Seinfeld is always studied, I guess, from a psychiatric perspective because the main characters are fairly neurotic and display symptoms of other psychiatric conditions. But I always look at George because I think he's the one who stands out the most. And in this case, he was pretty neurotic about the fact that he had to pay a fee for missing his appointment or not giving enough notice. But then when the doctor had the same issue, he insisted on charging her for the fee and was pretty ticked off that she wasn't going to honor it.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple teaching points to this. Number one is, I think a clinical pearl, I mean, it certainly could be reflected on shelf exams, but the clinical pearl in terms of what behavior George manifests by doing that, and certainly by demonstrating that, is that, there goes the PC. So wrong choice. So that, again, we'll switch over to Instagram Live solely if our Zoom fails us. But when an individual presents to you with a chief complaint of blank, and this certainly applies to psychiatry, but you could apply it to other aspects of medicine as well, I'd like you to first consider that what they are about to tell you is completely within normal limits, right? It's completely culturally sanctioned. And it doesn't matter what the chief complaint is, right? Just train your brain to treat people like that. And when they provide clinical evidence to the contrary, then you move off of point one, right? And, quarterly, after the first year of your career, 5 years into your career, if you're batting like 99% that you always go to step two, you could curse me out, but I want your brain to work like that. And I want you to continue that through the rest of your career, right? Unconditional, positive regard. So, from George's perspective and his commentary in this case, Larry David's commentary on the medical field, completely normal. Completely normal. On the other hand, there are other aspects of George Costanza that might allow us to say, there's more going on here. And let's talk about this now through a psychiatrist's perspective, getting into that other realm, step two of abnormality, right? So outside of a culturally sanctioned norm, right? So that's point number one. The other comment I want to make about this is that when we are talking about normal versus abnormal, I want to also discuss another definition of another clinical term, and that's disordered, right? Because you'll see that D word pervasive every page of the DSM. Disordered behavior is abnormal behavior that results in clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning. That is going to be our governing definition of what a disorder is. So behavior is always normal until it's not. And then we can differentiate abnormal outside a culturally sanctioned norm versus normal. And then even one step further than that, the behavior that is disordered versus that which is abnormal but not disordered. And that line to be drawn is clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning. All right? So that's number one. Number two. The other teaching point I want to make for George Costanza, and you kind of hinted at by reflected in your use or your choice of words, neurotic, is that he is likely demonstrating abnormal, if not dysfunction behavior or disordered behavior, right? And one of the reasons why is because we cheat. Just like in the medical field, we have a past history, whether it's a past psychiatric history, whether we want to label it a developmental history. We have prior episodes, for those of you who have enjoyed Seinfeld, knowing that this is not just lightning in a bottle. This is not just a slice of time. This is a pervasive pattern of behavior demonstrated by George Costanza, which, by the way, we do know results in clinically significant distress and impairment in vocational as well as interpersonal functioning for him, right? So those are, I think, the two main teaching points we can draw from your initial observation of George feeling disrespected in that physician's office. Any other comments on George in that particular scene?
I think it's funny the way he behaves and kind of reacts kind of very boldly, and he makes a stance, and I think it's like a relatable experience, which is why it's really funny. Maybe like the action he takes as a secondary thing is not what I would do, but I definitely have all those feelings when I feel like there's injustice. It's funny.
And specifically, what action does he take?
He like gets really loud, and then he starts asking for money from the doctor. I probably would think those things and not yell. Maybe I would yell on the phone to someone else when I get in the car. You know.
And what would that demonstrate if you did that? Hypothetical you, collective you, not picking on any one person.
It's like, for me, it's awareness of like the social environment I'm in, what's appropriate then.
So just interpreting what you just said, awareness, meaning that your superego will prevent you from acting on that impulse.
Right.
All right. So, but why yell at somebody else then?
Isn't that like one of those defense mechanisms? Right? I don't know if it's I forget the name. Displacement.
Get louder.
Displacement.
Yeah, yeah. So what happens here is that you have an impulse, and the impulse is warehoused in the id, right? That primitive part of your brain, probably the hippocampal / amygdala region. But a lot of the drives of that limbic system does not come to conscious awareness, right? It doesn't reach the prefrontal cortex because that's where the superego resides, right? We're going to lend some anatomy to the Freudian constructs. But that's a problem because when those types of impulses are not allowed to be cathexed or discharged, Freud called that anxiety, right? That little angel on your shoulder preventing that little devil on the other shoulder from actually expressing itself. It's anxiety. Right? Now, everybody right now is struggling with this because I could guarantee you, because I'm a psychiatrist, everything that your id wants you to do is now being ignored, right? Whether it's suppressed, repressed, through denial, whatever. It's being ignored, right? Because there's zero chance that if we were able to look into like an id meter and answering the question, what would you like to do or be doing right now? Zero of you, I mean, big fat zero would say, well, conference table, up until 8:30 in the morning, hanging out with a physician, so I can spend an entire day in the hospital working. Zero, right? However, in looking at your eyes, also a psychiatrist, I can tell that nobody here is anxious. So either I just lied about this mismatch, this friction, inducing anxiety, or there's something else going on. So what else might be going on before if anybody here calls me a liar?
Adequate coping?
Yeah. How? Mom and dad put you up right, yada, yada, yada. Okay, but how?
Learned behaviors and patterns.
There's something to that. Yeah, there's something to that. More specific? Your ego. Right, your ego. Right, now Freud focused on the ego and therefore ego strength as being a subconscious process or an unconscious process, using those two terms interchangeably, and probably shouldn't. But, and then later on, ego theory, the ego was provided some level of conscious awareness too. So wherever you stand on that continuum is largely irrelevant. But the ego's primary function is to navigate this conflict. Right, it's the referee. Unlike the referees last night who threw a flag every other play, you have ego strength, meaning that there is some coping mechanism in place to alleviate that anxiety caused by that friction between what you want to do, your id, and what you're allowed to do, your superego. And suppression is but one example of that. Right, suppression is but one example, or displacement. Displacement is but one example of that. All right, so that's long-winded explanation as to the observation you had, and thanks for sharing about you yelling at your best friend. But that's displacement. And when they yell back at you, hey, I didn't do anything, reassure them, hey, this is just a normal function of displacement. My supervisor told me. So.
I think with George, too, it was interesting to call back to his conversation with Jerry, because he was fishing for compliments, right? He was like, oh, never was anything positive about me. And then Jerry, like, you have really good hearing. And then he uses that really good hearing to make his point later on. And I think that speaks to his low self-esteem and like maybe some depressive kind of symptoms that he sometimes shows here and there.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about that. And that's a recurrent theme in for George too, is that he has virtually no self-esteem. And in those episodes where we have Frank and Estelle as characters, George's mother and father, we get a look into why George has such low self-esteem. Right? Anything else about George? All right, what other characters or what other scenes did you observe and want to discuss?
Jerry and his frustration that everyone greets him with a kiss. And then after he mentions that he's done with that, everyone else gets upset with him in the complex.
So what's that about? And remember, this is pre-COVID, right? This is when it was perfectly fine to greet people like in that way.
I think that touches on a bit the culturally sanctioned norms that you talked about. So for everyone else, that was a normal behavior, but for him, he had a personal boundary that he didn't want to do it. So then when he told them no, people seemed a bit offended because it was normal to them.
Yeah.
Well, from a behaviorist perspective, he could have said no passively or assertively, but he went pretty aggressively because he had held on to it for so long. And I think some of it was the delivery versus the content of what he was saying.
Yeah, and we see a nice parallel here with his best friend George, in that he was bold in the way he said it because it had bubbled up or it kind of simmered for so long, and he didn't manifest constructively, right? It was an over the top, I'm putting my foot down type of thing, very similar to what George does in that waiting room, right? But this apartment has adopted a new culture. There's a culture shift, and it doesn't fit everybody. But this one person decides to make it an issue in terms of putting his foot down, making sure that they understand where he's at. No more kiss hello. Right?
And in addition to him kind of, I guess, exploding at the end, he's also passive aggressive in the beginning, with the refrigerator. He kind of, instead of just saying I don't want to do this, he kind of slams the door in her face without saying anything. So he's kind of on both extremes of the spectrum in a way that differs from a societal norm.
Yeah.
And typically when someone's passive aggressive, we know the aggressive is coming because usually it's hard to maintain.
Right. So the end is actually, scientific or evidence-based. It actually fits with the natural progression and how this can get overwhelmed, and it does for Jerry. Just a brief comment before we move on from Jerry and Jerry Seinfeld, the character in this particular episode. It is the kiss hello. Is that that kiss hello and what happened? That turnaround at the end, both the turnaround and then what Jerry says, shouting for Mary, is a direct allusion to the film we'll be discussing at noon. Right. And that's by design, and hence why you had this particular episode assigned for discussion today, matched with It's a Wonderful Life, which we'll be analyzing over noon lecture today, or at noon today. Any other observations for Jerry?
I felt that his approach with regards to the kissing still probably rings true today if you, for example, are not a person who likes to shake hands or greet with a hug, maybe for personal reasons or hygienic reasons. I still think people would kind of react maybe not to the extent of his neighbors, but some people might be put off by you reacting in a similar fashion.
Oh yeah, no doubt. Again, it's hard to get to know an individuals, and we're talking about now interpersonal interactions. Very hard to understand the full value system of an individual and how to navigate that. And then it's even 1,000 times more difficult when you have to make that snap judgment literally upon saying hello, because you have virtually no information about them. Unless you know them from a previous encounter or, of course, have an enduring relationship. But otherwise, you know nothing about them, which is why, again, we'd have to ask Larry David if he did this by design. But the focus is on the kiss hello. I mean, it's really on the hello. When you don't know anyone, when they're a blank slate to you, how best to interact with them so as not to offend and still have your value system remain intact, right? That's something that we ordinarily don't think of. It's more of a subconscious process, but more and more we have to reconsider this, and there's more and more of a conscious effort behind this now. Right?
Especially if you consider individuals who are really traumatized and maybe touch triggers, right? Because hello could be very triggering for someone with sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm. Especially physical contact upon hello. I mean, and this actually segues to, I think, another point, and this focuses, certainly on multiple people, but certainly the cohort of those who might be cognitively impaired, somebody like who's struggling with schizophrenia. Nonverbal communication. So even when you don't say the words hello, the embrace, the handshake, the extension of the hand is going to be interpreted. Mm-hmm. And while there might be a person who, upon seeing you, put that right shoulder forward and extend your arm, extend your hand, might do the exact same thing, that's not 100% of the time, right? And that has everything to do with their own history, and that might include a trauma history in the most severe of circumstances. Similarly, individuals who are struggling with schizophrenia, especially chronic and severe schizophrenia, when you actually interact with individuals who are stricken with such severity of illness, sometimes just squaring your shoulders up is a sign of aggression. So no words, but how you make eye contact, how you approach the situation, and how you actually sit in discussing the reason why they're coming to see you in the hospital today, or in our case, why we're seeing them in the hospital today, is a form of nonverbal that you have to be cognizant of. So. Again, I think certainly more of a clinical pearl than what you might see reflected on a shelf question, but you never know. Other comments, other observations about Jerry?
I think the group think around everyone ganging up against him was kind of interesting.
Against who?
Against Jerry. After he set his boundary very firmly. Because, of course, he only originally offended Mary, but it spread to the entire apartment building, and they were all kind of agreeing to isolate him from their in-group.
Mm-hmm. Larry David explores that the phenomenon of the group dynamic in several of these episodes, with Peterman, even peripheral characters, and it's no coincidence that what Kramer in this circumstance ends up starting and certainly forwarding is along the lines of cultish behavior, and that's a topic or a subplot that Larry David has certainly addressed in multiple episodes. There isn't a single person outside of Jerry who we hear support the idea that, I don't want to do this, right? Everybody goes along with it, right? And there's randomness to it too. It isn't like they're all from the same hall or the same floor, I should say, and would have known each other. Matter of fact, the contrary is true, right? These are people that you actually have to look up on the wall, find their face and match it to a name, to be able to say hello, right?
Since you brought up Kramer, I guess it might be a good time to talk about him very quickly. Because I remember in this episode they wanted him to tell Elaine's friend, the physical therapist, about her hairdo, because I guess they weren't brave enough to do so.
More passive aggressiveness.
More passive aggressiveness, yeah, exactly. But I guess in this case they were disappointed because he actually liked the hairdo. But I think in general throughout episodes they always rely on him for that purpose.
Yeah. There's something with Kramer's frontal lobe. He doesn't have that filter that Jerry or even George has. And out of the mouth of babes, he will say things that other people will not say, although also think. That is Kramer's role. He does have that quality about him, and he really probably struggles with a cluster A personality disorder. Certainly there are some episodes where we could say that it looks like it's schizoid personality, the individual who is both physically and especially emotionally disconnected from others, and prefers it that way, right? Tend to avoid interpersonal relationships, and will engage in relationships when there's almost a definitive chance that they're going to be safe, emotionally or otherwise. On the other hand, there are episodes in which Kramer, and maybe this is an episode that kind of gives us a little bit of a sneak peek at this, demonstrates magical thinking, some bizarreness of behavior outside of a cultural norm, on the fringe of a cultural norm, the kiss hello, and therefore, along with that emotional disconnectedness, might actually be more consistent or demonstrate behaviors that are more consistent with the schizotypal personality, right? It kind of oscillates between the two. The other cluster A personality disorder, the paranoid personality disorder, every now and then Kramer may have a sense of paranoia, but that's not overwhelming, right? It looks like the other two cluster A's really, we can go back and forth as to which one fits Kramer. I think it really is episode specific. In all three conditions, just looping back to the other comment I made about nonverbal communication, all three conditions do confer some risk of developing a future psychotic disorder, such as schizophrenia, with schizotypal personality disorder being or having that strongest risk or the highest risk. Matter of fact, in the DSM-5, the American Psychiatric Association Press copied and pasted the diagnostic criteria of schizotypal personality disorder, and it is now also in the schizophrenia spectrum and psychotic disorders chapter of the DSM. So you could find it in two separate chapters, right, because of that level of risk. All right, we're right at the bottom of the hour, 2 minutes to go. Any final thoughts or any last observation? No, I'll take that as a no. Oh, actually, wait a minute. We had one.
I'm forgetting their names, but like when they went on that ski trip, and then the physical therapist just kind of had her friend just like walk. Like I thought it was just random, and then how like their friendship just like she went to her to help her with I think it was her shoulder, and she got offended because she wanted her to pay. I think that was just like very random.
Yeah. Yeah, although for Elaine it's not. Elaine has an incredibly difficult time enduring meaningful adult interpersonal, that's a lot of words, interpersonal relationships. Very difficult time with that. So the fact that this particular episode ends that friendship is no surprise, knowing this, again, pervasive pattern of behavior demonstrated by Elaine Bennis. We see it a lot with her intimate relationships with men. But it also applies to her meaningful relationships, or lack thereof, with women as well. And this episode certainly demonstrates that. All right, we're going to stop it here. We'll get an extension, so I apologize for the interns following our stream. We'll be right back on Zoom in a couple of minutes and see you on the other side.